These are HiFiMan's high-end Arya Stealth headphones. But why are they called Stealth? It's not because they're black, it's actually because of the design of the magnets inside them. Let's take a closer look. Thanks to Headamp for sponsoring this review. Headamp are the makers of the legendary Blue Hawaii electrostatic headphone amplifier, as well as the Gilmore series of amps, including the new GSX Mini. They also sell the HiFiMan Arya, as well as some of the other products in this review. Now, since HiFiMan originally made the HE1000s with this kind of design and the Edition X, they've made a number of different headphones, and one of them, of course, is the Arya, and they've updated this with the Arya Stealth magnet version. Now, today I'm going to take you through the design of these headphones and the technology in them and why they're called the Stealth variation of the Arya headphones. And of course, I'm going to give my impressions of how they sound, not just through the very expensive equipment I have here, but through some cheaper equipment here, so you can get an idea how they'll perform, at least more or less, through different levels of amplification. So let's get started with the design. So since the original HE1000s used this kind of teardrop shape, obviously inspired somewhat by the Stax Lambda system, they've made a number of headphones which have become very successful, and it has some very good and bad points about the design. First of all, this spring steel headband, obviously again inspired by Stax, but a very clever variation of that design which allows for even pressure when they put them on your head, whether you have a large head or a small head. And then you have this easily adjustable clicky headband which can be replaced as well if it wears out, to give you the kind of fit on your head that you need. Now, you get a lot of variation in here because the ear cups are pretty huge. So for example, even if you have very large ears, then you should be able to get a comfortable fit. And unlike Odyssey's phaser system, which has very kind of sharp edges on the front, the magnets in here are very smooth, so even if your ears do touch the magnets at the back, you won't have any trouble with comfort. In my experience, of course, with the ear pads now, these ear pads are very comfortable as they are, but after maybe some years, especially as they start to fill up with oil from your face and hair, they do eventually wear out, become soft, and kind of fall apart, but they are readily replaceable. They just pop out. They're held in by a number of simple plastic catches, and you can replace them either with earpads from HiFiMan, or if there are third-party earpads available, then you can replace them with those instead. All the same, it's a very comfortable system and very easy to leave on your head for long periods of time, unless for some reason you just don't like headphone clamping at all. They do have a fairly firm clamp, but they don't need a super firm clamp, and they don't need to seal around your ear because they are open-backed, and very open-backed, in fact, to the point that the amount of sound that comes out the back is as strong as the sound that comes out towards your ears. And the negative of this is that because the planar magnetic drivers, or orthodynamic or isodynamic drivers, depending which terminology you want to use, most people these days call them planar magnetics, because they move very fast and they can reproduce very fine sounds, that even if I put my hand this far, like a foot out from the headphones while I'm playing back music, the reflection of sound from the drivers off my hand back onto the drivers does affect the sound. So it makes a noticeable sound change as I move my hands around here while listening to music. They are that sensitive, and that means they are headphones primarily for listening like I do at home in front of my desk or somewhere, of course, very quiet. They're not designed really to be transportable or usable in any situation where the sound coming out from the headphones would be an irritation, or external sounds are loud and would interfere with music playback. They're definitely at home or home office or private office headphones in that regard. Now, they also, I should note here, some people have had issue with the delicacy of these headphones, and that you don't really want to drop them. So I'm always careful to hang them on a good headphone stand that holds them securely, because they can be somewhat more susceptible to rough treatment. So there are indeed things that you buy and take careful care of so that you don't damage them. However, if you do, they are repairable, at least, of course, as I said, the primary things such as the head pad and the ear pads, but also the cable is removable, like a lot of high-end headphones. And the cable itself, which I've got plugged into a Cord TT2 behind me, is, well, it's not the most wonderful cable out there. It's covered in, well, like a what we call shoelace material kind of material, and it's a little bit stiff, but otherwise generally basically fine. But it does use 3.5mm connectors on the headphone end, and that means it's compatible with a huge number of headphone cables from many companies. We have Meze, Focal, Sony, and of course other HiFiMan headphones, and probably a bunch of others I can't think of off the top of my head. But it means you can readily get replacement cables if either you desire to get a longer or shorter one, or one with a different termination, or what have you. And then HiFiMan sent me one with a 3.5mm connector. And in the end, actually, I used a cable from an aftermarket cable from Meze, which I'm using on the 109 Pros, to test gear which had a 4.4mm connector. So I actually used this headphone cable with them when I was testing with, say, portable gear. But in the end, that leaves a pair of headphones that give you a lot of options with what you can do with them, but only if you're going to be using them at home. Lastly, before we get into the sound, what's with the stealth in the name? To explain that, we have to get into the design of planar magnetic headphones a little bit. Now, normal headphones have a voice coil on the driver which sits kind of around a circular magnet, but with planar magnetic headphones, the magnets are behind the driver or behind and in front of the driver, such as in the case of these headphones. That means that the magnets will interfere with the sound coming from the driver. So HiFiMan has optimized the design so that the amount of interference from the magnets will be minimal. And they've done this by making what they call stealth magnets, which are rounded. Now, what to use their own words, this dramatically reduces wave diffraction turbulence. Now, that means basically as sound passes through any kind of gap, and how it travels through and around objects is, well, it's a whole science in itself. And to prevent basically interference from these sound waves traveling through the magnet, they have made them rounded. Now, in addition to that, the headphones have a 32 ohm impedance, which is fairly standard for a lot of headphones these days. And they have a sensitivity of 94 decibels, which I presume is per milliwatt. And that makes them relatively easy to drive. Not the easiest to drive, but easy enough that they should power well out of most equipment. And with that, well, let's talk about how they did perform. Now, for most of my listening, I used the Aryas through some high-end gear, such as this Chord TT to an M scaler set up behind me, or we have ALO Audio Studio 6, which is my primary amp, and I also have that hooked up to a variety of digital to analog converters, my main Yggdrasil, and we have a Gustard R26 in for review as well. But mainly I used them with good amplification, and I also tested them with, say, low and mid amplification to give you an idea of how they'll perform. So first I'm going to give you my impressions of these with the kind of my main system. Now, to explain the kind of sound that they have requires a little bit of, well, a little bit of science, but not too much. So generally speaking, they are fairly flat through most of the frequency range, except maybe the treble, which is a little bit peaky. Now, if you're looking at measurement graphs, you may see many of them, depending on the measurement rig and how they are calibrated, will show something along what I've just described. However, there is a big bump in the mid-range in a lot of measurements which are uncompensated because our ears are less sensitive through the mid-range, around the 2-3 kilohertz mark, and that means that when designing headphones, they have to boost that area to compensate for that. And that's why most graphs will show a bump there, except ones that have had a compensation curve applied. Now, there is some peakiness in the treble, which means they do sometimes sound a little bit bright, and I'll talk about that in the music impressions shortly. Now, that complete flat measurement, depending on, well, there are a lot of discussion about this, is not necessarily considered completely flat. It's what I call old school flat. And if you've seen my videos going back years, that was the kind of old school target neutral. Now, to that, when listening to most music, it does sound a little bit boosted in the mid bass. And this is not necessarily a bad thing. I think that works out very well for headphones, but maybe sometimes you do wish for a little bit more rumble. However, that big open driver does make sound very airy, much like, incidentally, an electrostat. So it does give a floating feeling to the music, where it does seem to have very good imaging and very good space around the instruments and very good delineation and good quality recordings of where sounds are coming from. which can be a tricky thing to do, especially with headphones. So in that regard, if I kind of say if you want to know what electrostats sound like without having to buy a pair of electrostats, get something like one of these HiFiMan headphones and you have that kind of general idea. Whereas they do sound kind of open and airy to some degree, there's enough of what we most bass in there, which is actually the mid bass, that they do sound reasonably full with a lot of music, depending on how well it's mastered. Now, the reason I talk about this is the more modern idea of neutral is called the Harman target curve, which people will talk about a lot. The Harman target curves, and there are more than one, so don't take it as an absolute science, were based on research of what roughly 80% of people would hear if they were listening to music through a high-end speaker system in a well-treated room. And that ended up having more lower bass and slightly less mid-bass, which is why I say that compared to, say, maybe that kind of system, they do sound like they have a little bit of a boosted mid-bass, even though the technical measurements show them as flat through from the bass. It seems that our idea of actually listening neutral has slightly less mid-bass and slightly more low bass to varying degrees, depending again which Harman target curve we're talking about. But anyway, I wanted to emphasize that because for a long time, even way back from 2009, this idea of flat through from the bass kind of dominated our discussion and confused us at first because simple old school dynamic driver headphones tended to have not so much low bass but a big hump in the mid bass, and we got used to this, and having a more flat and even frequency response was a little bit confusing. So as things go, probably from a perception point of view, for most people, and again it's not all people, they do sound a little bit warm again through the mid bass, and again it depends very much on the music. And maybe they don't have quite as much rumble as some people may desire, but that means they work best, I find, with, say, acoustic music where you want to have a little bit of body in there, but you want to have the focus on the instruments, which is something they do very well. Now, when you're talking about the mid-range, they have a fairly typical mid-range, which is somewhat forward and does bring out things like guitars and vocals very, very well. The only problem is that the treble sounds maybe a touch bright and a touch fatiguing depending on the kind of music you listen to. So if I'm listening to some acoustic music or maybe classical, say an orchestral recording, the brightness kind of was maybe about right. It makes it sound more open and spacious. However, with, say, more modern recordings, I found that kind of sound to be somewhat fatiguing after listening for some time. In terms of overall detail, they're pretty on the mark for this kind of price range, the $1,000 to $1,500 mark. I could clearly make out, given that I spent a lot of time listening with, very high-end headphones, that there was not quite as much fine detail. Some of the slight nuances were missing compared to the higher-end, the $4,000 headphones through the high-end gear. It's not something you might notice so much if you're using, say, lower mid-end gear, because that gear tends to mask a lot of that fine detail anyway, but it's something that I noticed on my system. So I'd say in terms of overall performance, they were about spot on in terms of resolution. So let's get into some of my music impressions. Now, starting with Death Cab for Cutie, Waterfalls. Now, this song is presented with a slight smoothness through my system, some of which is the result of upsampling applied. In this case, I was using it through Audio GD's R27HE with a HQ player running from Roon. Now, though it's pop music, the treble is pleasant if the overall tilt is on the bright side, which is something became a general thing that I noticed while listening. Now, the thing is, if the Aryas have a fault, it's again that they are on the bright side, and of course that didn't mate so well with pop and rock. If things like Zola Blood's Play Out, which is from their Infinite Games album, which otherwise might work best with a headphone that's more bass heavy, had the, albeit digital, drum hits delivered with such precision and speed that the lack of bass didn't become an issue. And that was one of the main things about owning a planar, is the speed at which the driver can move and the resulting resolution. It's just very enjoyable. Now, it's much kind of like, as I said before, like what I appreciated from electrostats in general, where again, their speed made up from their often amplifier-related lack of bass. With the planar magnetic headphones, that you don't have to spend huge amounts of money to get good bass from them, unlike electrostats. Now, Dead Can Dance, which some people have thanked me for putting them onto. Now, they returned in 2012 after a 16-year absence with their Anastasis album. And as before, the blend of world music with the kind of opera-like storytelling has me wishing more than anything that the recording had been made in a concert hall with an actual orchestra rather than having had post-echo added to the music itself. And of course, this is always wished for more higher quality recordings. But regardless, having the music float out to me through the arias proved highly pleasant. Now, a couple of songs which were happened to be in order but had much the same kind of result was Los Lobos, which is Song of the Sun from the Gates of Gold album, and Leo, I don't know if I pronounce this wrong, forgive me, Leo Kotke and Michael Gordon singing I'm a Lonesome Fugitive from the Clone album. Now, out of the Chord Hugo TT2 and M scaler, which I use because they are completely and totally neutral as far as the manufacturer is physically capable of making, the imaging of this song was pleasant with a clear separation between instruments. And it's very apparent how the older style free field-like tuning, and this is as I was talking about before, flat through them from the low bass through to the mid-range, and that pushes the bass a little bit forward, and well, the higher treble peaks make the sound more open, as I previously described. Now, this was most pleasant with these acoustic tracks, especially given the latter, where the track from Leo Kotke, where the guitar is delivered up front as required without overwhelming the sound. Now, this is where I started putting the music through different amplifiers. So, for example, if I played Gretchen Parlato's take of Sweet Love out of a few different amps to get an idea of how the Arya Stealth scaled with different amplification, I started with a Shit Valley 2 Plus, and this is the slightly older 6922 version with a good Amperex PQ tube fed by a Shit Yggdrasil. Now, the Arya Stealth gave me the impression of a slight looseness to the sound with a bit of lack of clarity from the percussion. However, the bass, while loose sounding, made for a warm and inviting listen. Now, this is something I found to be pretty normal with the small Shit Audio amps, the Magni and Valley. And this is because I primarily believe, due to the simple power supply, that the control over the driver is somewhat limited by the power supply. So the overall sound kind of ended up very loose, listenable, but is clearly kind of not really in control of the drivers. So moving on up to a mid-range amp, so, we have things like the Shit Audio Jotunheim, the Topping A90D, the Singzer SA1, that kind of thing, results in more space around instruments and definitely way more control of the driver. So this is where the sound really cleaned up, and above that you tended to get, if you get into the more expensive amps, you get a bit more refinement and a bit more space. But one of the interesting combinations which I found worked really well, you can just see over my shoulder, was the Audio GT R2R11 Mark II. Now, I did a whole video on this DAC amp combination. It is a non-oversampling R2R ladder DAC with an amplifier built in. Now, the amplification isn't the greatest thing on earth, and the DAC isn't the greatest thing on earth, but the overall combination, actually with the Arya Stealth, was really pleasant and made for really nice, easy listening. Now, I know that HiFiMan's Fang Bian also likes non-oversampling DACs, and of course he makes non-oversampling R2R DACs and even portable players which are R2R based. And so it's not a surprise that the combination worked really well with the Arya Stealth, especially with that slightly peaky treble. The slightly greater smoothness of something like an R2R DAC made for more pleasant listening, and it's probably one of my favorite easy listening combinations. Now, if you can get even more refinement out of the R2R11 by pairing it with even a mid-range amp such as the Jotunheim 2 or one of the other ones I mentioned, for an even better listen, it works really well as a DAC. And it was one of my favorite combos overall when I just want to relax and listen. Likewise, I can run these out of the R27HE, which is sitting just next to me here, and for an even more refined listen. Now, that has an Audio GD Master 9 built in. I actually have a full Master 9 hiding under the desk because I've ran out of space on the rack to show it. And that upped the game even further with more space around the instruments, more nuance and detail. But I think that's kind of where it hit the proverbial wall with what these are capable of. I wouldn't tend to spend more than about the cost of the headphones on an amplifier or a DAC, but they do work really well with something like that kind of combination Audio GD amps, which tend to have a very smooth present and extremely detailed presentation, something like the Master 9, combined with something even maybe like this Gustard R26, very smooth listen, maybe not as detailed as some of the higher end DACs, like the shit Yggdrasil, but combined with something like a good smooth amp or even a tube amp if that's to your preference, and the Arya Stealth were made for a very good combination. So what happens then if you improve the DAC? So what I did is I went straight to the Chord TT2 and M scalar combination directly, which provided more front to back depth and more distinction in the sound space as to where the instruments were. However, there are some subtle nuances that I'm used to, again, hearing with the more expensive headphones, such as the Dan Clark Audio Expanse and Mezzi Elite, that I couldn't make out with the Arias, such as the most subtle nuances in percussion, things like cymbals, especially towards the end of Gretchen Parlato's Sweet Love, where there is some very rapid percussion. Overall, that led me to feel that amplifier in, say, the $400 range, such as the shit Jotunheim, or again, topping A90D, Singer SA1, all those kinds of things, or even the Audio GD Master 9, which of course, as I said, is very good with planar headphones, would be most ideal. Now, the Jotunheim itself has something of an old school hi-fi sound with kind of more slight touch of warmth, with nice depth to the sound, unlike the kind of maybe flatter sound of things like the topping A90D and Singer SA1, which they tend to focus, they tend to be very punchy and somewhat detailed, but the soundstage tends to be a little bit more flat, and you want something that can bring out some soundstage depth to these to be most ideal. That's my preference anyway. So as far as a good quality pair of planar magnetic headphones go, I think they're really spot on, and it reminds me of the original Edition X, which was quite a hit at the price. I think they sold for around the $1,500, $1,600 mark originally. These are of course an upgrade, and I always wish that they take something as good as the original HE1000 and put it in the kind of Edition X kind of setup, and I think that's close to what we have here. Although of course now if you want to upgrade further, you can go to the new HE1000s, and even if you can get them for a good price, get a pair of Susvaras for even more refinement, though you should up your gear to match. But if you're not going to go crazy with amplification or your DAC, or you want something kind of similar priced in terms of equipment, then these are definitely spot on in that regard. So I hope that gave you a good idea of how HiFiMan's Arya Stealth sounds. And if you did like that and you would like to get my buying advice, do consider becoming a patron and supporting the work that I do. Now, do you own a pair of these? Do consider posting below your impressions and setups that you have, so that people don't just get my idea of how these headphones are, but get other people's ideas as well, because these videos are designed to help people make buying decisions and give the best balance of advice possible. If you are going to consider buying a pair of HiFiMan Arya Stealth and maybe even a full setup, do consider buying them from Headamp. Justin, as I said before, has been around since before some of these companies that have made products behind me existed. So you are getting it from someone who has been in the industry quite a long time, and even manufactures his own high quality amplification. So as always, thanks once again for watching, and I look forward to seeing you online.